In this video, I want to tackle an entire AP macroeconomics free response exercise with you. Assume that the economy of country X has an actual unemployment rate of 7%, a natural rate of unemployment of 5%, and an inflation rate of 3%. Using the numerical values given above, draw a correctly labeled graph of the short run and long run Phillips curves. Label the current short run equilibrium as point B. Plot the numerical values above on the graph. So pause this video if you are inspired to do so, but I will now work through it. So remember, Phillips curves show the relationship, or the theoretical relationship, between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. So I'm going to do the inflation rate in the vertical axis, which is typical. And then on the horizontal axis, I am going to do my unemployment rate. So this is going to be my unemployment rate, which is going to be a percentage. Now we want to graph the short run and long run Phillips curves. Let's do the long run first, because we've seen before, the long run just sets our unemployment rate at the natural rate of unemployment, and it isn't related to our inflation rate. It'll just be a vertical line. And so it'll be a vertical line at our natural rate of unemployment, which is 5%. So maybe it looks just like this. So I could call that our long run Phillips curve, and it's going to be right there at 5%. And now I have to do the short run Phillips curve, and that will show a relationship between inflation rate and unemployment. And just think about what's going on. If you have a low rate of unemployment, especially if it's below your natural rate of unemployment, well then there's a lot of demand for people. And so people say, hey, if you want me to work, you got to pay me a little bit more. And so that could just lead to a higher inflation rate. And then if a lot of people are unemployed, they might be willing to work for less, or they might have less money in their pocket with which to drive up prices. And so you will have this inverse relationship right over here. So this is the short run Phillips curve, which is downward sloping. And then they say label the short run equilibrium as point B. So let's say this is point B right over here. And they say the short run equilibrium, we have an unemployment rate of 7% and an inflation rate of 3%. So our unemployment rate right over here is 7%, and our inflation rate right over here is 3%. All right, let's do the next section. Assume that the government of country X takes no policy action to reduce unemployment. In the long run, which of the following shift to the right, shift to the left, or remain the same? So here they're saying short run aggregate supply curve. Explain. So here it's kind of tricky because you might be thinking they're asking about what you just drew, but here they're talking about aggregate supply. So let me draw a graph to even help visualize this. So if we're talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, our vertical axis is going to be our price level. I'll just call that PL. And our horizontal axis, that is going to be our real GDP. So this is real GDP right over here, GDP. Now, you're just going to have a long run supply curve, which is vertical. That's just the full employment output for our country. So that's the long run aggregate supply. But what about the short run aggregate supply curve? Well, that's going to be upward sloping. If price levels are low, people might not be willing to output a lot. And if price levels are high, people will output more. So our short run aggregate supply would look like that. I'll call that sub 1 since we're going to think about how it shifts. And then aggregate demand would look something like this. Let me draw it like that. And notice our equilibrium point right over here, let me call that aggregate demand right over here. Let's call that Y sub 1, and we are at price level sub 1. I drew it to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. I drew it to the left of the full employment output because we are dealing with a recession here. Our unemployment rate is higher than the natural level of unemployment. So if our actual unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment, what will happen to the short run aggregate supply? So one way to think about it, at a given price level, because there's people out there looking for a job, you might be able to get more output. Or for a given amount of output, it might cost less because there's just people out there competing for that work. And so you would have your short run aggregate supply curve shift to the right. Short run aggregate supply sub 2, and then your equilibrium price level would go down. Price level sub 2 would go down. So I would say it would shift to the right because excess labor in market would work more for less. And then you could also see that from this graph, the price level of labor would go down. Now, what about the long-run Phillips curve? Would that shift? Well, that's what we drew up here. And it's important to realize that the long-run Phillips curve, just like the long-run aggregate supply curves, those don't shift unless you somehow fundamentally change the economy. The population changes, the technology changes, you've conquered land, whatever it might be. But if they're not selling you any of those things, then these long-run curves, the long-run Phillips curves and the aggregate supply curve does not shift. So this remains the same. All right, let's go to part C. Identify a fiscal policy action that could be used to reduce the unemployment rate in the short run. All right, so let's make sure we understand this is a fiscal policy action. So these would be things like reducing taxes or increasing government spending. Don't be confused and give a monetary policy of somehow increasing the money supply or something like that. That would be a monetary policy action. But a fiscal policy action, I could say it could be a tax cut. A tax cut. That would put more money in people's pockets. It would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and it will result in a higher equilibrium level of output and a lower unemployment rate. Draw a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply and show the impact on the equilibrium price level and real gross domestic product of the fiscal policy action identified in Part C. All right, well, I just explained that. But let me redraw it. And we already drew one aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. So that is our price level on the vertical axis. And then this on the horizontal axis, I have real GDP. And now let me draw my long-run aggregate supply curve. It's upward sloping. We already talked about why. Long-run aggregate supply. And then our aggregate demand. At a high price level, people might demand less. And then at a low price level, people would demand more. So our aggregate demand would look like that. And we're going to show it shifting. So let me call that aggregate demand 1. And so let's call this our real GDP, this level of output 1. And then this is right over here. This is price level 1. And they say to show the impact on the equilibrium price level and real GDP. Well, as I mentioned before, if you have a tax cut, you're going to have more money in people's hands. And it's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. So aggregate demand is going to be shifted to the right. So that's aggregate demand 2. And so you see that that led to an increase in real GDP and an increase in our price level. So that's price level 2. And I think I did everything that they wanted me to. Based on the change in real GDP identified in Part D, will the supply of country X's currency in the foreign exchange market increase, decrease, or remain the same? Explain. So we saw that real GDP increases. So because real GDP increases, national income increases. They're really the same thing. National income increases. And part of that increased national income, there might be more demand for foreign goods and actually even potentially foreign assets. And so demand for foreign goods goes up. So you have an increase in supply of X's currency. More people will want to buy foreign goods. They'll probably want to buy more domestic goods as well, but they're just going to be doing more buying in general. So that's going to increase the supply of X's currency as they go out there and say, hey, yeah, I want to get some more of those imports. Based on your answer to part E and assuming a flexible exchange rate system, will country X's currency appreciate, depreciate, or remain the same in the foreign exchange market? Well, if the demand curve stays the same, but the supply curve shifts to the right, so to speak, if you increase the supply and the demand stays the same, well, then the price of something goes down. Or if we're talking if we're talking about foreign currency, the foreign currency will depreciate. And we are done.